John Harbaugh and Eric DeCosta hinted at some changes for the Ravens this upcoming offseason. We talk about that, them revealing what happened on some drama situations, as well as general takeaways, all that and more coming up on this instant reaction edition of Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Oestreicher of Ravens Wire, here with you on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for being here today, making Locked On Ravens a part of your day and your first listen each and every single day. Free and available, all podcasting platforms. That includes in video form on YouTube, where you can like and subscribe to the channel. Also in audio form, where you can follow along and subscribe as well for 5 days a week, plus more of daily Ravens coverage. Even during the offseason, even though the season's over, we are still coming at you 5 days per week, plus bonus episodes and live reactions like this as well. Today's episode is the reaction edition of Locked On Ravens, is brought to you by FanDuel. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, your new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Little midweek afternoon live edition of the show. Eric DeCosta and John Harbaugh spoke to the media for their end-of-season press conference. So figured just hopping on here, giving a little instant reaction. We can talk about what they had to say. This, for me, I think, revealed a couple of different things. Now, there were some changes that were hinted at by Harbaugh and DeCosta. They weren't necessarily these sweeping changes and everything is changing and everybody's leaving. Of course not. And I wouldn't expect that. I've said that. That's not what's happening. But there were positions of priority that were talked about, some free agents, some potential extensions. So there was a lot to dive into with this whole situation. Plus, we got some details from Eric DeCosta and John Harbaugh about some of the drama situations that the Ravens dealt with throughout the season. Marcus Williams, Deontay Johnson, and obviously Eddie Jackson. And I thought that those answers were really interesting because there were some accountability moments from Eric DeCosta, and there were some overall just details in general that we can talk about. So appreciate everybody for being here this afternoon and spending some time with me. And let's just go. Let's dive into it. John Harbaugh, Eric DeCosta hinting at some changes. The first thing, and I think we'll start this off because this is a name that everybody is talking about, not necessarily in a good way. That's Brandon Stephens. Brandon Stephens obviously had a really tough year last year. And, I guess this past year, last year he was good, but it was a drop-off compared to what we saw from him and what everybody honestly expected from Brandon Stephens. And heading into this year, I think a lot of people felt confident in the Ravens cornerback rotation, and Brandon Stephens was a really big part of that. But, then all of a sudden he has the year that he has. And there's a lot of questions now in terms of the long-term stability of keeping Brandon Stephens on the roster. So John Harbaugh and Eric DeCosta were asked about that. And in terms of Stephens, DeCosta's answer wasn't necessarily super inspiring in terms of if he'll be back or not. DeCosta said he was a great pick. He's grown a lot. We'll have to see what happens with him, and he's helped us win a lot of games. But there was also the reality that DeCosta talked about, which is that Stephens will have an opportunity to go out there and have a chance to test the market and see what his value is. So saying that he's probably going to have a chance to test the market out, it feels like for the Ravens, that's not a great sign in terms of him coming back to the roster. Because, look, at the end of the day, if the Ravens wanted him back, they'd probably make a push to re-sign him. Not that they're not going to, not that it's set in stone that Brandon's not going to be back, obviously. But they might just say, hey, go see what you're worth on the market. And, maybe if it's a team-friendly deal, the Ravens would bring him back. But I'm not really anticipating Brandon Stephens being back next season. And I think that's for the best, if we're being honest. I don't think Brandon Stephens can be on this roster next year. And I agree with DeCosta. Look, he's a converted running back. He was moved around a lot and kind of, pulled here and then pulled there. They shifted between corner and safety. But look, this team's trying to win a Super Bowl. And it was very clear and very evident that Brandon Stephens was the weak link on that defense. So that to me stood out. I thought that was pretty big, I guess a pretty big way of saying that, yeah, maybe Brandon's not going to be back on the roster next year. But then you have other situations as well where I think that a couple of priority positions were made about, particularly on the offensive line and safety. Those were two that stood out to me during the press conference. Eric DeCosta said he was actually looking at safety film up in his office before coming down to do the press conference. He said that for the offensive line, the decision there to get younger last offseason was absolutely the right decision, and there were some growing pains there, but not that many. And honestly, I agree with this. Like, I feel like the way that the offensive line performed this year, early in the year, those first two games where the Ravens started off 0-2, yeah, there's not a lot of things you can say about how bad that O-line played, because they very much so contributed to that loss, both losses. But as the Ravens went along with their season, I thought we saw growth from guys like Daniel Falele, right? I think we saw growth from Patrick McCary. Obviously, Roger Rosengarten excelled once he took over that starting spot at right tackle. So we always knew that this was going to be a multi-year offensive retooling season, right? Offensive line retooling season. But I think from what my expectation was, and I'm not saying that, Daniel Falele and Patrick McCary were these like the two best guards in the NFL. There were certainly some problems and some issues, most definitely. But my expectation was like this was going to be at the very best, like a middling offensive line unit. And I think by the end of the season, Ronnie Stanley staying healthy, Tyler Linderbaum playing the way that he has over the course of his career, Rosengarten stepping up, and them having passable guard play for the most part, it was better than I thought. But this is not done. This is not over. It's not. Because when we talked about this last offseason, losing 3 starters was a big blow. They went young, and it worked considerably better than I thought. But now there are questions, and John Harbaugh and Eric DeCosta were asked about, well, what about Roger Rosengarten flipping over to the left side? Because Rosengarten does have that ability, and we know that Ronnie Stanley is a free agent this offseason. And, we don't know what that's going to look like and if Stanley's going to be back. He obviously chopped the last year off of his contract, so he is going to have the ability to either cash out with a team if he wants to, or maybe he comes back to the Ravens on a more team-friendly deal. But Eric DeCosta did point out that Rosengarten can play both sides and that he's mature beyond his years, got better and better. I'm really, really high on Roger Rosengarten and what he can do. But DeCosta on the offensive line said, quote, we'll look at that and have discussions with players. We'll look at potentially bringing back our guys. We'll look at the draft. We'll look at free agency. We'll overturn every rock to find as many offensive linemen as we can. We have some good young players on the team. One thing we've seen over the years of that position is guys get better as they get older. I expect a great year from Roger Rosengarten in his second year. But I feel like Baltimore does have to be aggressive because McCary's a free agent too. And I don't think that he is your long-term solution at guard. Ideally, it'd be a guy like Andrew Voorhees, and, he can go in there and try to figure things out and have a better second, I guess it's his third year technically, but second year fully healthy. I don't necessarily know for the Ravens. I would assume that it's so 50-50 on Stanley for me because I think that he earned another deal and Baltimore would have no issue in bringing him back. But I guess it just depends on how comfortable you feel. And, maybe this is a question, if you're in the chat with us right now, you can answer it. How comfortable you feel that Ronnie Stanley could play another fully healthy season, because he's obviously dealt with his fair share. And I want to give Ronnie a lot of credit for what he was able to do. But this offensive line rebuild is not done by any stretch of the imagination. I would expect the Ravens to get aggressive and draft another offensive lineman in the earlier rounds, not necessarily a lock in the first round. I could see it, but I would expect them day 1, day 2 to probably add another offensive lineman, particularly at the guard position. And I see Matt here in the comments saying, I think we should re-sign him, but take a tackle. I don't disagree with that. I mean, if you feel like Ronnie Stanley has like 1 year left, right? Let's say there's one more good year of Ronnie Stanley. If maybe that's what your mindset is. Taking a tackle would have to be a priority. The thing for me, though, and I see Matt saying around 2 or 3 and develop a guy, the thing with the Ravens and their situation, and if you were with me on Locked On Ravens last offseason, we talked about this. it's an interesting conversation to have because if they re-sign Ronnie Stanley and take a tackle, let's say in the first round, let's just talk first round. If they do that, you're losing value on that first round pick because this is a team that's in contention every year. And do you want your first round pick sitting on the bench for an entire season? Or would you maybe kick someone into guard and have that guy play guard potentially? And then when Stanley leaves, go and kick him out to tackle. So it's an interesting conversation on the offensive line. And then just to get back to safety for a little bit, because that was another conversation point that DeCosta had. He said that, if the Ravens can add another safety, it'd be really good. He also said it gives us multiplicity, but listen, we're blessed to have Kyle and Darius back there. We have good young corners with Marlon. I'm actually fine with the way the secondary looks right now. I'm not opposed to the way the secondary looks, especially if they can add another corner. The thing with the Ravens, and look, a safety would be awesome because you're going to have to replace Marcus's spot. Assuming Brandon Stevens doesn't come back, you're going to have to replace Brandon's spot as well. And obviously, with Eddie Jackson being gone, that's essentially 3 spots on the roster that you didn't have open at the start of the year this year. But the Ravens love running those 3 cornerback rotations. I think people are also forgetting Arthur Millette will be back unless they decide. I don't think he saves a lot of money on the cap. So he was signed to a 2-year deal. So he still has one more year left on his contract. If the Ravens can get that 3-corner rotation that they like, those outside cornerbacks, we know they love to run that. Marlon Humphrey, Brandon Carr, Marcus Peters, or, obviously with Jimmy Smith back in the day when they had Marlon and Brandon and Jimmy Smith. Those were those 3 cornerback rotations that the Ravens loved. And they had Tavon Young in the slot. Like, they like having rotation and optionality with that secondary. So in my opinion, this Ravens team has some work to do, right? They have to get better. This is a huge offseason. But in terms of sweeping changes across the board and trading everybody and getting rid of everybody and resetting, it was never going to happen. And John Harbaugh also talked about his coaching staff a little bit and some changes that could maybe happen there, but also could maybe not. So coming up in the second part of the show, we'll dive into that. We'll talk a little bit about John Harbaugh. I'm seeing his name in the chat a lot as well. And also some Ravens drama details. Those were revealed by Eric DeCosta and John Harbaugh as well. So be sure to stay tuned. We have a lot to get to on this instant reaction edition of Locked On Ravens, breaking down John Harbaugh and Eric DeCosta's end of season press conference. First, this show is brought to you by FanDuel. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. That's $300 to keep the action going. The FanDuel app is easy to navigate, and the variety of bets keeps every game exciting. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. No waiting around for your winnings. Whether you're betting on your favorite team or just looking to add some extra excitement to the playoffs, FanDuel has you covered. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. Get started with $300 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Back here on Locked On Ravens, Kevin Oestreicher instantly reacting with you to the Eric DeCosta and John Harbaugh end-of-season press conference. Baltimore season obviously ended at the hands of the Buffalo Bills in the divisional round. Again, appreciate everybody for being here on Locked On Ravens. We're still coming at you with daily Ravens coverage throughout the entire offseason. I've been doing this show since 2019. My first ever episode was about Kari Vedvik right before that season started. I've never missed a weekday episode since. Today's episode, we talked about Dan Orlovsky. We talked about Lamar Jackson. That episode was 1,428th consecutively for me. We're also doing a huge audio and video revamp this offseason as well. That'll come gradually over the next couple of weeks. So really appreciate everybody for sticking with me here over on Locked On Ravens. Let's start off with a question here from Be More Cat here. John Harbaugh, are you happy with Harbaugh coming back is the question here. I'm content with it. I'm more content with it than I was last year, if I'm being honest. I don't have necessarily a strong opinion because I didn't think the Ravens were going to do anything. To me, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, right? I think that's a big thing you have to consider. And I've been a very big proponent of playoff growth, and this was a step down. And I think that this coaching staff has to be held accountable for that. I think John Harbaugh has to be held accountable, obviously the players as well. I'm not discounting the mistakes that, Lamar made, Mark Andrews made, etc. But my take on the whole situation is that John Harbaugh should enter next year with his seat warm, and this is it. Next year is it. If there is anything less than an AFC Championship game appearance, maybe even an AFC championship game win. It's really tough to fire AFC championship coaches. I wouldn't expect them to do something like that. But I'm saying if they lose in the wild card next year, if they lose in the divisional next year, or if they don't even make the playoffs, there should be a change. And John Harbaugh actually was asked about his contract because he is in the last year of his deal. He is up for an extension. I think he's up for an extension this offseason, but obviously the contract expires next year. And he kind of said that at the end of the day, I'm trying to find the comment here, but he kind of said, like, whatever happens. He said, I'm happy. I just got it. It's just the people I work with every day. I'm fired up for it. I'm not worried about those kinds of things. They take care of themselves. So he's not necessarily stressing about it, but, apparently Harbaugh necessarily hasn't gotten to the specifics about those conversations, but Jeff Rebick at The Athletic did add context and said Steve Bisciotti, the Ravens owner, has said multiple times over the years he doesn't want a lame duck head coach. And I don't think John Harbaugh at this moment is a lame duck head coach, but again, the goal is to win Super Bowls, right? The goal is to win Super Bowls. So again, John Harbaugh says he talks to Steve Bisciotti all the time, talks to Derrick DeCosta all the time. And the fact that he's not worried about those kinds of things, that's not what he should be focused on right now. I mean, he has the year on his deal, and then that will kind of happen as it happens. But to me, you can't just be content with postseason, like, wild card exits and divisional round exits. That's something that you can't be content with. Like, this is a team that is in contention for Super Bowls every year, and in the playoffs they have underachieved. And I'm not sitting here and telling you that John Harbaugh is the worst head coach in the NFL or that he doesn't deserve a job after this one. He does, and he will get one whenever his time with the Ravens runs out. But sometimes it's just time for a change, and I think that that's why my take on it is, like, they weren't going to do anything this year, whether you agree with that or not. They weren't going to do it. But this next year has to be the final straw. Like, it has to be it. If the Ravens go on and win the Super Bowl, then obviously John Harbaugh buys himself time, right? But at the end of the day, we can't just sit here after every season and be like, well, they had a great regular season, but, their playoffs or another wild card exit or a division round exit. I mean, it's not acceptable. It's not acceptable. The championship game last year was growth. It was. But now you're kind of getting yourself knocked back down a peg to the divisional round. You're just like, well, you're going backwards. So you have to find a way to combat that and shift the narrative that you can't rise up in those big moments. But that unfortunately has been the situation. Let's shift gears a little bit now to the drama. We talked about it. If you were with me on Locked On Ravens, which, by the way, be sure to like and subscribe in video form and audio form. We talked about it all year. There was a drama situation here and a drama situation there. And Eric DeCosta and John Harbaugh were asked about those situations. So let's start with Eddie Jackson, because I thought that this actually was the most interesting comment of the three. Eric DeCosta took responsibility for the Eddie Jackson situation and said that he essentially failed him. And he did note that, look, Eddie Jackson didn't want to accept the role as a backup safety, special teams type of guy, but he should have better understood how he'd handle that, being a veteran, being someone who was as accomplished as Eddie was. And I'm not going to sit here and make excuses for Eddie. I think, to me, it is about the team. And if, you're asked to do something like that, and, it's a hit to your pride, it's a hit to your ego, I understand. Like, I get that. But again, it felt like the Ravens had a lot of situations this year, and Marcus was different. And John Harbaugh, Eric DeCosta made it clear that, Marcus was a team guy through and through, and John Harbaugh talked about that. But for Eddie, it's like, it's one thing to be upset with your role. It's one thing to not like the role that you're in. But for me, if it starts like, there was a report about the outburst that Eddie had in front of players and coaches. Like, once it gets to that point, obviously, you have to move on. And I know that Baltimore couldn't move on from Marcus because of his contract, but based off of what was being said about him from a Marcus Williams perspective, and John Harbaugh talked about this, he said, quote, "It was a tough season for Marcus. I admire the way he handled it. He faced a lot of adversity, just kind of came with the production at the end. There's no way to pin it on one thing. You have to look at it as a whole." But he did say that he was a team guy through and through, and he'll always be grateful that Marcus took that approach with it. So I think it's just two ways of looking at it, where, like, Marcus accepted that it wasn't working out. He knew that he wasn't going to get cut because of the situation. So, he decided not to become a distraction. Where for Eddie Jackson, look, both those guys' plays didn't warrant them stepping on the field. I just think one handled it better than the other. And I don't look, a guy can be unhappy. A guy cannot like what they're being told is going to happen with their role. But like I said with Deontay Johnson, if it starts impacting the team, then that's a whole different conversation. And it's rare we have these situations back to back, like it happened in Baltimore this year. This felt like a weird year. And they still had like a historic offense. Their defense was the best in the league over the second half of the season. And we're still here. I just think you have, I don't know. I don't think it was like a locker room issue where like their locker room was toxic, but clearly they had to make big changes defensively for, the Marcus and Eddie situations. And I just don't feel like, we've been used to seeing that level of drama, or if you want to call it a distraction. I know the Ravens didn't call it a distraction. I certainly thought it was some level of a distraction, but I thought the biggest distraction was Deontay Johnson. And, there wasn't really too much detail on the Deontay thing. Derrick DeCosta said that they understood the risks when it happened, and he had acknowledged we knew it wasn't 100% going to be a slam dunk. It didn't work out. We always try to mitigate our risk. I didn't see a lot of downside. He talked about how there wasn't a big risk from them in terms of the capital that they gave up, which is true. I mean, they barely gave up anything for Deontay, but I think it was just such a net negative in terms of the way that he impacted things. And it's a weird situation too, because after that Houston game where Deontay was on the Texans, you could see him laughing around with his teammates and kind of, joking around with like Derrick Henry, Isaiah Likely. I think Lamar was in there. And again, like from the reports that I've read, it's not a personality issue with Deontay. Like he's apparently like a very like nice guy, at least from what the reports were saying. Just when he doesn't get the ball, it gets super, super volatile for him. And he tends to lose quickly with that, or like he does not accept that role. And that's been a conversation in Pittsburgh, in Carolina, in Baltimore, in Houston. That is a trend, and it's unfortunate. And even like from just hearing some of the stuff in Carolina, where it was like Deontay was one of the reasons why Bryce Young didn't have a great start to his season. Carolina was bad at the beginning of the season. Bryce wasn't great, and Deontay had really bad energy apparently. Like that, those are some of the reports I've read as well. And it's tough. Those situations, I think it was nice to hear kind of more context added in those, but you got to be able to, I guess, understand those situations a little more. And again, I'm not going to sit here and like say that John Harbaugh and Derrick DeCosta, like they have gone out there and made all these terrible signings and like this, that, and the other. You're not going to hit on all your signings. You're not going to hit on all your trades. Like it is what it is. And I think that they both have earned the benefit of the doubt, but I think it's quickly running out. And for example, for a guy like Harbaugh, where it's been the same old over and over again. So I think that's why John Harbaugh's still in Baltimore, because he earned that benefit of the doubt. And the Ravens said, okay, maybe this is the year. But you can't keep saying that, in my opinion. Like you can't keep going back to that well over and over again, where you say, okay, maybe next year, still a great regular season. Like let's run it back. This has to be it, because next year there are a lot of contract decisions. We'll talk about that in the final part of the show, but this is the last year where you can add. You don't have the free agent list that you had last offseason. The Ravens have lost a lot of people these last couple of years. You don't have that problem this offseason. There are a couple of guys that I would like to see back, and then the rest of them can probably just go and you can upgrade your team. So I think that for Baltimore, if they don't get the job done this year, there have to be bigger changes, and there will be bigger changes, because then you have to start having conversations about other contracts, extensions, where that money goes. And so coming up in the final part of the show, we'll be diving into more of what Harbaugh and DeCosta had to say, because I thought there were more interesting comments. So be sure to stay tuned for that. There is plenty to dive into on this instant reaction edition of Locked On Ravens. First, this show is brought to you by Talkspace. Therapy as a game changer can help manage stress, improve sleep, and communicate more effectively. But finding the right therapist and fitting sessions into a busy schedule can be a challenge. That's where Talkspace comes in. Talkspace, a leading virtual therapy provider, makes getting the help you need easy, accessible, and affordable. With Talkspace, signing up is simple. You can match with a licensed therapist who fits your needs, usually within 48 hours. It's convenient. You can have sessions from the comfort of your home and even message your therapist between appointments. Plus, Talkspace is covered by many insurance plans, and for most insured members, there's 0% copay, $0 copay. It's never been easier to prioritize mental health. And therapy has so many benefits. And to me, therapy is a great space to be able to talk things out. So you learn a lot about yourself in the situation. Just learn a lot about life in general. And as a listener of this podcast, you get $80 off your first month with Talkspace. When you go to Talkspace.com/LockedOnNFL and enter promo code SPACE80 to match with a licensed therapist today, go to Talkspace.com/LockedOnNFL and enter promo code SPACE80 to get $80 off your first month and show your support for the show. That's Talkspace.com/LockedOnNFL, promo code SPACE80. Back here on Locked On Ravens, Kevin Oestreicher live talking with you about John Harbaugh and Eric DeCosta's end of season press conference. Again, really appreciate the support here on the show. We had a great season here on Locked On Ravens. We surpassed 11,000 subscribers on the YouTube side of things and the audio side of things. We grew that show each and every single day and continued to add to that community as well. So again, if you're looking for 5-day-a-week Ravens coverage, or if someone tell a friend, tell a family member that we have them covered during the offseason. I know it can be tough listening to coverage on your team after the season ends the way it did. So for all those who are with me here, I appreciate you sticking with me through the offseason. And if you need a little break from Ravens content, I understand. I would love for you to stay along for the ride, but if you need a little time off, I've been there and I understand it, but we're still going to be here for you regardless. So be sure to stick with me here on the show. Now, let's dive into a little bit more about John Harbaugh and Eric DeCosta, what they had to say. A lot of praise for players like Rashod Bateman. DeCosta saying he's very proud of Rashod Bateman. The guy had some adversity along the way, came back this year with some vengeance. It's a great story. I think he's just getting started. He's a great person and works hard. Plus, I think the big thing here is extensions, right? We heard a lot about the extension conversation for guys like a Derrick Henry, who obviously, Derrick had that contract and it's a 2-year deal. I thought it was a great value deal when the Ravens signed it at the time. I mean, the way Saquon, Josh Jacobs, Derrick Henry, those were the big three, right? And I think the Ravens got the best value out of that. Obviously, Derrick rushed for over 1,900 yards this season. Getting him on that $16 million, at least. I know he hit incentives this year, but it was a great deal. And DeCosta on potentially extending Henry said, well, look at that. I'm just grateful that Derrick chose us last year. His attitude and the way he played was great to watch. I can't wait to see him next year. I know it was tough on him to end the way it did. I think we have a chip on our shoulders. But those extensions for Derrick Henry and for some other guys as well, those aren't the big ones that are coming up. The big ones coming up, Tyler Linderbaum and Kyle Hamilton. Those two are both extension eligible. And we know that those two are going to set the standard. I think Kyle Hamilton is going to reset the safety market. I think Tyler Linderbaum will reset the center market. And obviously, the Ravens like to do their deals to where it's money early on those deals is more so non-existent. It's backloaded so that as those contracts ascend, other contracts come off the books. So obviously Marcus will be off the books. The Ronnie deal, the Ravens will have to make a decision next year on Marlon Humphrey, and that's another decision that they will have to make as well. Isaiah Likely is eligible. So that's another conversation too, where Eric DeCosta did acknowledge that all three tight ends are in the final years of their deals. Mark Andrews obviously is a big conversation in terms of what his future looks like. And if the Ravens will cut him, move on from him, trade him, restructure that deal, or just keep him in his current number, he's making, his cap hit is $17 million and his cap savings would be $11 million if they were to cut or trade him. It's not a small amount of money. I think that could be used for an upgrade at a different position, but I don't just want to come on here and say, oh yeah, Mark is so replaceable. Mark and Lamar have had 7 years worth, which is crazy that those two are going into their 8th years, but 7 years of undeniable chemistry. And while Isaiah Likely has established that through his 3 years with Lamar, it's different with Mark. Mark had a bad day. Mark had a terrible day at the office against Buffalo on Sunday. And we can all acknowledge that and say that he is a big part of the blame, or at least who deserves the blame of that Ravens loss. But he's meant so much to the franchise. I just think that the playoff stats have not been there. And that's something that, we can all acknowledge and accept. And, for me, Mark is a player that it's almost like he's someone that gives you a cushion at the tight end position, where it's a luxury to have Mark and Isaiah Likely on the same team. And this is an interesting comment here from Wadislav saying, even though, he's the second tight end after Likely, he said he'd keep Andrews. He's been superb for us. And that's absolutely correct, right? He has been superb for this Ravens team. And in my opinion, one game doesn't change that, but the playoff success in general, right? We're talking throughout his entire career has not been up to snuff compared to the player that we know Mark Andrews is. So again, I know Mark is feeling all sorts of emotions right now, and we're just going to have to see how his offseason unfolds. But this, if the Ravens keep him, this will be the last year of Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely, in my opinion. You can't pay tight ends that money like that. You can't do it. So for me, Baltimore has a tough decision here because Andrews means so much to the team and to the franchise, but there's something to say about potentially saving all of that money. That it's, you could upgrade at O-line, you could upgrade at safety at corner, but you're losing a big part of what your offense has become. So in my opinion, this Ravens team has a lot of tough decisions to make, including on Mark Andrews and also on guys like Ronnie Stanley. So I don't know where they go, but in terms of sweeping changes, like I said, that's not going to happen, right? And he also talked about the play calling, saying when you're not successful, the play calling is going to get questioned. And he actually went into detail about that goal line sequence after Rashod's long catch that got them down to the 2-yard line. Said that the Bills ran all-out blitz on first down, stopped Henry, and he actually wished that they would have thrown on first down because of the look that they gave. And obviously, if everybody's rushing, there's going to be nobody to cover. So running on first down, obviously the Bills were expecting that. And then, you have a conversation where at the end of the day, this Ravens team is going to have to look in the mirror because there were some times this offseason where the play calling just was not there. I think that Monken had a fine season. And if you've been with me here on Locked On Ravens, you know that Todd has been good. I just don't think that Todd has been like, I was expecting a little more from Todd through 2 years, a little more. It's not like this big, oh, Todd has been so bad and so terrible. But I just think the Ravens sometimes start too slow on the offensive side of the ball, and then they just kick it into gear, or they start really fast and then, they fizzle out. So I don't really know, because Monken, the Jacksonville job is now up in the air. We don't really know what's going on with Jacksonville right now. So it's just, I feel like Monken will be back, and Harbaugh did talk about how, especially even like defensively, there's going to be some level of like uncertainty until guys are officially locked back in. We know the Ravens have we know the Ravens have lost a lot of coaches recently. So that's another big aspect of what this Ravens team could do. Patrick Ricard, Eric DeCosta said that he'd love for him to retire as a Raven because that's what Ricard said. He said he'd love to retire a Raven. Also, on the Hard Knocks series, John Harbaugh said it wasn't like we had a choice on that, but, the Hard Knocks folks were first class. They weren't intrusive. Harbaugh was very vocal about not being on board with that, but I think it ended up being okay. I think it ended up being fine, and they're okay with how that ended up turning out. So the Ravens have an interesting offseason because they're going to be able to just, in my opinion, upgrade. There are a lot of years where Baltimore loses some guys and you have to downgrade at a certain position. I think this is a prime upgrade year for the Baltimore Ravens. So I'm going to say that, the Ravens have this big year ahead of them. And if they can't get it done, then you have to look at more sweeping changes. But my takeaways from this press conference were that we're not going to see those sweeping changes. And I think that's probably for the best, but I'm giving it one more year. And if they can upgrade and they're still in the same spot they were, and we're sitting here a year from now talking about another wild card or divisional exit, we can all be real and say that, yeah, it's probably not working out. So that's all I have for you today on Locked On Ravens, talking about John Harbaugh, Eric DeCosta, and this press conference. We're going to get more into it tomorrow. We're going to have our show come out at 6 a.m. Eastern time, so be sure to stay tuned for that. We're going to dive into more takeaways and as well as just the latest on the Ravens and how they can improve their team. So be sure on the way out, hit that like and subscribe button in video form. Follow along in audio form as well. I'll see you right back here tomorrow on Locked On Ravens.